Welcome to part dose of relationships. And we are going to talk a lot about, in this section, the relationship stages and the life cycle of relationships. But first, we're going to talk about a thing called the Johari window. And the Johari window is essentially a graph of a relationship. And if you read the chapter on perception, you saw the Johari window in that section because you can use it to take a look at yourself. I don't think it fits there very well, so I put it in the relationship chapter because it fits so much better. And the Johari window is essentially a graph of a relationship that you have with somebody. And it is essentially a four-paned window. If you're looking at your PowerPoints, you'll see that is comprised of four boxes. And there's two types of information that comprise those four boxes. And it is self-disclosure and feedback. And self-disclosure is when you share important information. We've already talked about that in the last video. And feedback, we talked about way back in the first video. It's where you share, you receive messages and you respond using feedback. And so now we're going to take a look at the Johari window, and I'm going to explain those concepts in the context of the actual window. So, in the first box, it's called the open box. And the information that goes in the open box represents a high level of self-disclosure and a high level of feedback. Meaning, both you and that other person are communicating a lot. Because this is information that you both know about you. So this would be like your name, your gender, hopefully. I guess some people might be confused. Eye color, hair color, basic information like that. Now, in a good relationship, this box should be huge. Because in a good relationship, in theory, you share a lot, both people. So this box is continuing to grow. The second box in the upper right hand is the blind box. And this is information that you are not aware of about yourself that somebody else is. Meaning it represents basically feedback. And in a good relationship, do you want that box to be big or small? Small, right? Because this represents them sharing feedback with you. If it's not a good relationship, this box is going to be bigger because they're not expressing themselves what they witness. So maybe you're condescending, or maybe you have an annoying laugh, or maybe your zipper's down, or you have something on your shoe that you're not aware of. These are all things that would go inside the blind box. And some of those things have no impact on your communication skills, but others do, like you're condescending, or maybe you laugh, or you treat people like dirt. Those would be examples of things that you would hope people would share with you. So you want the blind box to be small. The third box is in the lower left. This is the hidden box. And what this is information that you know that they don't know. So it represents self-disclosure. And again, in a good relationship, do you want this box to be big or little?
Little.
Little. Same reason as the blind box. Because in a good relationship, you are sharing information with them. Now, you can't share everything, and you don't want to share everything, even with your most close intimates. And so, there are two types of information that can basically go in the hidden box. The first type is information you just haven't got around to telling them yet. Like, you didn't tell them what you had for lunch. You didn't tell them that you were adopted. You didn't tell them that you were, maybe you have the diabetes or something. You didn't tell them those things. So that's information that goes in here until you share it with them. But it also might be things that you're intentionally keeping secret from them. Like you murdered your friend and buried him under your porch. Or that you were adopted. Maybe you don't want people to know. Or maybe you don't want people to know that you have like some horrible disease like HIV or hepatitis C or something that people have a stigma around, so you don't tell people. And so that's what kind of information goes in the hidden box. Again, good relationships, you want this box and the blind box to be small because it represents high deals of self-disclosure and high deals of feedback. And and you want the open box to be huge. Now, the fourth box is dumb. If I had my druthers, I'd remake this to a triangle or a circle and have 3 parts. Because the unknown area represents things that neither one of you knows that still can somehow theoretically affect how you communicate. And if that's as confusing to you as it sounds, then you're right on track, because it doesn't really make any sense.
It's like Schrodinger's cat.
It is like Schrodinger's cat. You know, is it alive? Is it dead? It's both until you open the box. It just doesn't make any sense. It doesn't need to be there. Because are there things out there that we are unaware of that affect how we communicate? Certainly. But what are they? You don't know. And the minute you become aware of it, what happens? Where does it go? It goes into one of the other boxes, right? So you guys have an assignment of the chapter assignment for this chapter is to create a Johari window for somebody that you have a relationship with. And so be sure that you read the assignment sheet for a little bit more explanation on the actual assignment itself. But when you do the unknown box, be ridiculous. Make me laugh. People always put things in there like, oh, will I get abducted by aliens? Will I have 17 children? They just make it ridiculous, because that's how I view that particular box. It's fairly ridiculous. So that is the Johari window. And it's called the Johari window, by the way, because the 2 dudes that came up with it were Joe and Harry. That is why it is called the Johari window. Now we're going to look at characteristics of relationships, or dimensions. These are things that are in all stages of relationships. They're in all relationships to one degree or another. And you can tell what level a relationship is at based on these 7 characteristics. And the first of these is interdependence. And if you go back to chapter 1, we talked about interdependence. Interdependence is not just relying on somebody. That is a part of it, but it is way bigger than just relying on somebody. Interdependence is what you do affects them, what they do affects you, right? So your actions impact them and vice versa. So to somebody that you're an acquaintance with, if you have a child, is that going to impact their life very much? Probably not. But your best friend has a baby, is that going to impact your life? Sure, not as much as it impacts their life, but it's still going to impact your life considerably, because there's a whole new thing that's going to be taking up their time. That's interdependence. The higher up the pyramid you go, the more interdependence you should have. The second characteristic is depth. How deep is your relationship? Meaning, when you share information, is it shallow information like, hey, how about them Browns? Or is it deep stuff like, hey, what are your hopes and your dreams? The higher up your pyramid you go, the deeper the self-disclosure goes. The third step, the third characteristic, is breadth. And breadth means width. How many things do you share in common? And again, the higher up the pyramid you go, in theory, the more things you share in common, right? And this is an important thing, because many of you have probably been in relationships with people that when you first start a relationship, it's awesome because you share 1 or 2 important things, but as you start to move up that pyramid, you realize that that's it, it's all you got. And you end up, the relationship ends up stale and stagnant. We'll talk about that in a little bit. The fourth characteristic is commitment. And that's exactly what it sounds like. How dedicated and loyal are you to that relationship? Are you willing to sacrifice, or are you all about self? And again, using that pyramid, the higher up the pyramid you go, the more commitment you should see in a relationship. The fifth thing is predictability. Now, predictability is tricky, because it's actually kind of 2 things. The first thing is, how well are you able to predict somebody's how they're going to communicate or how they're going to behave, which is not necessarily that hard to do. But you can't count on that because people are, if nothing, unpredictable. We tend to behave in certain ways, but that's not always the case. We are irrational creatures. But the closer you are with somebody, the more likely you are to be able to fairly easily predict what they're going to do or how they're going to react. But the second part is the tricky part. Why? Understanding why somebody is going to behave or communicate in a given way. So for example, let's say you have a good friend and you know if you start talking about politics or religion, they just get wound up very easily. And so when you start a conversation with them about politics or religion, you know that they're probably going to get riled up and it's going to cause conflict. Most people can do that, even at the friend level. But it's not till you move up to the higher friend level or even the intimate level that you really are able to say, I understand why they get riled up. Maybe their parents argued about religion all the time, or their mom was Jewish and their dad was Catholic, so they had a lot of conflict around religion. So to them, it's a touchy subject. That's really the true sign of predictability. Being able to finish people's sentences, that's predictability. That is the fifth thing. The sixth thing is coding, communication coding. And that's where you share code. You share nicknames. You share, maybe it's a language. How many of you, when you were a little kid, especially the girls seem to do this a lot, created your own language? Probably a lot of you. And it's funny because I started hanging out with these two girls when I was probably about 14, and I figured out their language in about an hour. But I didn't tell them that I figured out their language in about an hour. So I knew what they were saying, but I played dumb, which is pretty handy when you can speak their language and they don't know that you understand their language, because people will say all sorts of things. Maybe it's a song. Maybe you and a friend of yours went on a trip somewhere and there was a song. For example, when I went to England in March of 2000, the big song on the radio, and I heard it a lot, was the Thong Song by Cisco. Thong, 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 thong. And so to me, my trip to England is represented by that stupid song. Like, they go together. And so maybe you have a song that you share with somebody that's your song. It could be nicknames that if other people heard, they'd be like, why is he calling you that? But to you, that's a sign that person cares a lot about you. And then the last characteristic is communication frequencies. It's exactly what it sounds like. The higher up the pyramid you go, the more you communicate with them. Now, that's not to say that you can't have intimates that you don't communicate very often with. My buddies in Colorado, I'm super close with them. They are intimates. If they showed up on my doorstep, it would be like I never left Colorado, even though I don't really communicate with them that often. But in most cases, the higher up the pyramid you go, the more you tend to communicate with those people. So those are the 7 characteristics that are in all relationships. And are very important parts of all relationships. You're going to want to know those pretty well. So now we're going to take a look at the relationship stages. A relationship is like any other creature. It's a living, breathing organism that has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And if you understand the various parts of those stages, you can form and maintain and end relationships better. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to go through these fairly quickly, just so you have an understanding. And these stages are based on the type of communication that occurs in a given stage. And the first stage is, of course, the beginning stage. This is where you meet somebody, you begin to increase your knowledge of them, through self-disclosure, through feedback. You start reducing uncertainty through questions and interactions and observations of their interactions with others. And you really just begin to increase your interaction with them. Now, this might be something that takes 10 years. It might be something that takes a week. Every relationship is different, but every relationship goes through this stage. That's the first stage. So the communication tends to be more shallow. It's not as deep. The interaction is still limited, but that's the first stage. The second stage is developing stage. This basically takes all those same things, but it increases them. So your self-disclosure and your feedback, not only do they increase in volume, but they increase in importance. So this is where you start to talk a little bit more about your hopes and your dreams, and you start sharing secrets with them. If it's a sexual relationship, this is where you start to enhance your physical contact, or your psychological closeness, or both. Your communication becomes more and more frequent. You start to have an interdependence emerge. And remember, interdependence is what you do affects them, what they do affects you. So you start realizing that you guys are linked in some way. Now, this doesn't have to be a sexual relationship. This is any relationship. Any relationship goes through these exact same stages. It's just characteristics are a little bit different. But that's the second stage. It's developing. And again, this is something that can take a couple of weeks. It can be at this stage for years before it progresses, just depending on the nature of that relationship. Then you get to a point where that relationship is topping out. It's never going to proceed higher. It's never going to go up higher than the pyramid. Now, it might not ever go higher because it's at the top, maybe. But it's the maintenance stage. This is where things are kind of maintaining sort of an even keel. You spend a lot of time together. Your social networks, meaning like your work friends and his work friends, actually start interacting. Your families start interacting. Like my best friend Tim, I call his mom, even though she's only like 4 years older than me, because Tim's 10 years younger than me. I refer to his sister as my sister. I refer to his daughter as my niece. You become willing to sacrifice your own security, your own well-being for the good of the relationship, for the good of that other person. You're willing to overlook those things that would normally bother you. Maybe somebody's a little bit argumentative, or they tend to be late a lot, or they're kind of a slob. And normally those are things that would really bother you. But when you're at this level of a relationship, you just kind of overlook them because you're like, that's just who they are. I can't change them. That's just who they are, and that's how they're going to be. And again, this might be something that is a few years. It might be a year. It might be 6 months. It might be 75 or 80 years, depending on the nature of that relationship. But all good things must come to an end. And relationships end, just like anything else. They end. And so all relationships dissolve one way or another. And basically take the previous 3 stages and just go in reverse. You start pulling back away from each other. You start becoming less willing to sacrifice. You start coming up with reasons why you don't want to hang out with them, or you don't want to involve yourself with them. Your circles start pulling apart, you start drifting apart. Every one of you who's been in this stage, you know exactly what I'm talking about when I say that you just start moving away. You realize that you're not satisfied with some element of that relationship. Now, that doesn't mean you can't fix it, because you can fix it, and we don't really get into that too much. We get a little bit into it later, but it is possible to fix it. But in many cases, we don't want to put the energy in to fix it, or we don't care enough. So we just let it continue to kind of drift apart. And then, of course, they end. And all relationships end one way or the other. And they can end positively, or they can end negatively. And obviously, the goal of ending a relationship is to end it positively. Because who here wants to end a relationship in a negative way? Most people don't. And so, ending a relationship in a negative way would be, manipulating them, just withdrawing completely. I know when I was younger, I'd be dating a girl in college, and she went crazy. So I would just disappear, off the face of the planet. Much easier back then. Today, with today's technology, it's much harder to kind of just disappear. But back then, we didn't have cell phones, so you could just kind of avoid that person. And that's a terrible way, because they have no idea. Even if they were truly in the wrong, that's a bad way to end a relationship. But we do that because, blaming other people is very easy. Accepting responsibility is very hard. And the truth is, in any conflict, it takes two. And so when your relationship is ending, you have just as much of a part to play as they do. And we don't like to accept that because that's hard. Feelings are icky, right? People don't like to, it's hard. And so for most people, it's easier for them to just avoid it, stick their head in the sand. That's a terrible way to end a relationship because they have no idea. So you shouldn't end relationships that way. It's a negative. A much more positive way to do it is to be direct, be open, be honest, say, hey, look, this ain't working out. We're just not, we're not getting along. This particular aspect, it just isn't working. Because remember, that other person is a person. They have feelings, they have hopes, they have dreams. And if you just disappear or blame them for everything, you're not taking that stuff into account. And that's how people end up like killing themselves or killing 50 people when they walk into a Walmart and just start shooting. That's the kind of things that happens when people end relationships with them in improper way because they are a human being and they have feelings. And so you want to, even though it's hard, nobody's saying that it's not easy because I know that it's not, but you have to be willing to say, you know what, I'm as much to blame for this relationship failing as you are. I understand that it's hard. You have to understand that they're going to have emotions because let's face it, even when both people realize a relationship is over and both people agree together that it's over, it still isn't easy because for so long they were part of who you were and now they're not, and so it's hard for both sides, and so you have to respect them as a human being. So that is a much more positive way to end relationships. But then other relationships end in a different way. Because the people interact, they continue to interact. If anybody watches Little People, Big World, about the Roloff family out in Oregon, they're little people. And the husband and wife have recently separated and then just, they're separated for like a year, now they're getting a divorce. But they still live on the same farm. They live in different buildings on the farm, but they still run the farm together. They still have 4 kids together. And so even though the relationship ended, a different type of relationship was born. So one ended and a different one started. So a lot of times relationships can transform. They don't just end. I know lots of people have been in like sexual type relationships where that didn't work out, and then they just became friends. It is possible. And so that's another way that relationships end, is just by transforming into something else. And so that is the end of part dos. We are going to finish the chapter up talking about relational dialectics, which is the second most complicated thing in the entire semester. Join us next time. Same bat channel, same bat